of the United States and the discussion within the United States. I feel a responsibility to convey to you the views from the Middle East. This discussion is very important, but the questions that are being raised there are completely different. These are not the questions that are raised in the Middle East. One question, I'll mention three as examples, and I would appreciate some answers to these questions. One is, why did the United States decide to intervene now, prior to the change of mind of the president? As Michael said, we all expected that he went to speak with the vice president, that he was going to announce the strike. And then why did they refrain? Is it really the chemical weapons? After all, chemical weapons, after all, more than 100,000 people were killed, and a humanitarian necessity would require intervention, perhaps, depending on who defines it. In the Middle East, and humanitarian necessity might be defined otherwise. If it's chemical weapons, there are other countries that use chemical weapons. The United States, in the middle, again conveying the perception from the Middle East. The friends of the United States used chemical weapons. Iraq against the Kurds. The United States used chemical weapons in Iraq, phosphorus bombs. Israel used chemical weapons in Gaza, phosphorus bombs. So why now? This is a very important question for the public opinion, for the intellectuals, for the leaders in the Middle East. I'm not talking about the government of Saudi Arabia and Qatar, of course, and Israel. I'm talking about the public in the Middle East. Number two, the United States decided, when the president decided to act and then decided not to act, it was based on two central themes. One is the credibility of the president and the United States, and the other one is the international law that all of you presented very well, right? But there's another question of credibility. The United States has no credibility in the Middle East. As Tony mentioned, Professor Chase mentioned, there is a problem of mistrust of the United States, not only because of Iraq, but because of the explicit goals of American foreign policy in the Middle East, right? So these policies are defined by three principles. Google them, you will find them. And so none of them has to do with democracy, and none of them has to do with governmentability. And the United States has been unclear about the support of democracy in the Middle East. That leads to the third question. Why the United States did not intervene before? Why the United States didn't pursue the line that was advocated here by Alex? Well, what's the role of internal politics in that? What would have been the major problem of having Iran on the Geneva table? What's the role of internal determinants and the role of friends of the United States in the Middle East? These are the questions that I have heard carefully listening to the intellectual and political debate in the Middle East, and I hope that some of them will be answered. Thank you.
Just to say that also picks up on a couple of the themes in the questions that were proposed from the Twitter questions as well, about accountability, why only non-allies are seen to be culpable, and also was the humanitarian intervention in Syria in part undermined because of what had happened in Iraq, and so we switched to the chemical weapons agenda instead. Ladies and gentlemen, would you like to respond to these very important questions?
I think this is a very important insight for us to have here now from somebody who really knows the Middle East, as Nadine does. I suspect, I mean, I am no spokesman for this administration. For that, you'd have to go to Washington. But as somebody who follows it closely, I think the U.S. decided to intervene now because to intervene before, again, based on the recent history, had not been very satisfactory. And this president was there to stop the wars. And I think he has been very reluctant. And that's why the second part of the first question, why he refrained thereafter. There has not been a clear policy. I think no wonder people in the Middle East are puzzled. But I think the move to chemical weapons, the move to weapons of mass destruction, is itself a game changer with repercussions far away. On the last question, of course, the role of internal politics is critical. I mean, if you don't learn anything else at Fletcher, students, at least read Putnam's two-level game. Every negotiation is Janus-faced, and it matters a great deal. And this is a struggling executive, almost more than any other time that I can remember. So there is no satisfactory answer, Nadine. I think the policy has been shaky. I hope that the black swan, or whatever the Russian motivation might be, is going to elevate the discussion and lead it to the kind of negotiation that we have been unable to find before.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that, and I'm certainly, thank you Nadeem and all the other questions, and I'm certainly not an expert in Middle East politics, and nor am I an expert in US politics, so I'm sticking my neck out here a little bit, but from the point of view of the US, I think the game changer that Professor Chase is talking about is that the humanitarian arguments, which were always there, and it's not as if the US or anybody else was ignoring what was going on in Syria for the last 2.5 years, including the thousands and thousands who were being killed, uncertainty as to who was responsible, and pretty clear that it was all sides that were responsible. And clearly there were national security interests of the US at stake, but not enough to overcome the reluctance to intervene. I think the introduction of chemical weapons kind of reinforced the humanitarian arguments, because all of a sudden in one day, these very indiscriminate, destructive weapons killed 1,400 people on top of the 100,000 that had already been killed. But also the national security arguments, the calculation changed. And so all of a sudden a couple of different motivations came together and prompted a shift in policy, but the determination to carry through on that was always questionable, and I guess that's where domestic politics came back. Tori's question about the US is a world superpower. Actually, I didn't say the US should stop being the superpower. I said it should not be the world's policeman. And what I meant is that it should not take it upon itself to enforce violations of international law. That doesn't mean that the US shouldn't act, especially in extreme humanitarian circumstances, which is why I was talking about this necessity excuse. So the idea is really states who can act should act when the humanitarian situation demands it, but shouldn't act simply because there's an international legal order and the international legal order is not being enforced to their liking through the Security Council or other institutions. I think that's the danger when you think, well, you know, we can take it upon ourselves to decide when international law has been violated and decide what to do about that.
Just very briefly, I really hope that this game changer is not just a tactical game changer of let's move towards a resolution of this very specific, very serious, but very specific tactical issue of the chemical weapons in Syria. I hope that this is a game changer in the sense that it's an opportunity for the US to get behind an overall political strategy for the Middle East. We haven't talked about Egypt. We haven't talked about Israel and Palestine and the occupied territories, or Lebanon, or Yemen. I mean, there are a host of issues for which the perception that what one gets is that the US is really handling these not in a strategic manner, but in terms of how they will simply play in next week's public opinion. And that is a recipe for continually running into preventable but very, very serious problems in that part of the world.
Let me pick up with a few of the issues that were not addressed. There was a reference to an obsessive focus of the United States on chemical weapons. Why do we look so intently at chemical weapons rather than conventional weapons? Because, as Ian pointed out at the outset, there is a ban in customary law on the use and possession of chemical weapons. And I think President Obama was correct. It is that the United States has itself a national security interest in ensuring that that taboo against the use and possession of chemical weapons is maintained. Anybody who reads about trench warfare in World War I has to appreciate why we have that ban. I think it's a good thing that weapons that horrific are outlawed, and it's a good thing that the United States is trying to do something about it. I think it's not a good thing that the United States is, as Ian also said, picking and choosing which norms of international law it will enforce. Why the ban against chemical weapons most prominently rather than the ban against use of force under Article 2.4? We can make just as powerful a moral case for the ban in Article 2.4 as you can, I think, for the chemical weapons ban. I don't understand why President Obama justifies this distinction on the grounds that chemical weapons are indiscriminate. Nuclear weapons are much more indiscriminate than chemical weapons. He's making an argument in favor of the elimination of the United States nuclear arsenal, if you carry that argument to its logical conclusion. I'm in favor, just to be clear about it, of the United States maintaining its position as a superpower. And to me, the question is a fairly simple and straightforward one. And it is compared to what? Compared to whom? Compared to China or Russia? I was horrified yesterday listening to the tape of President Obama's interview with George Stephanopoulos. I didn't see any commentary on this in the press today or yesterday. He said to Stephanopoulos, the United States is not in a contest with Russia. I can't believe a president of the United States would believe that, let alone say it. I mean, of course we're in a contest with the Russian Federation. They're trying to knock the legs out from under American power. They're trying to enhance their power at the expense of the United States power. I believe it would not be as good a world to live in if the Russian Federation supplanted the United States as the world's foremost superpower. Should we intervene in places such as Kosovo? I supported the intervention in Kosovo. And I remain convinced that there are tens of thousands of people alive today who would be in mass graves if NATO did not do what it did in Kosovo with respect to Yugoslavia. Syria is not Kosovo for many, many reasons. The probability is that the military intervention in Syria that is being contemplated was contemplated by the Obama administration, to my mind, would result in a worse situation rather than a better situation if the measurement is the welfare of the Syrian people. But I completely agree with Ian. I think that if at a reasonable cost, humanitarian values can be promoted through military intervention of the sort that we did in Kosovo, we ought to do it. And so it's only that very difficult cost-benefit analysis that causes me and two other things. The difficulty in foreseeing the likely consequences of the intervention, and B, the excessive breadth with which the congressional authorization was drafted that causes me to oppose it, but it's certainly not Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter.
Clearly, there are no easy answers to any of the questions that have been raised, and lots of uncertainty in many respects, and waiting to see how things are going to unfold. I'm wondering if anyone has any burning question that has not been raised, or something. Michael, you have a burning question?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Please leave if you like. I'm just extremely aware of the giant elephant in the room that nobody seems to be discussing, which is Iran, Israel, and U.S. credibility vis-a-vis red lines. I'm not particularly convinced by the humanitarian arguments or the arguments on grounds of norms governing chemical weapons, because I think that there are so many historical examples that show that upholding those norms is very much like we pick and we choose, right? So it's not consistent. So I don't actually believe that that's necessarily the main reason. I think that, as Professor DeWall said, a negotiated peace is probably the only way that this is actually going to be resolved in any sustainable, lasting way, because of the history of intervention in the region by Western powers throughout history, starting colonial times all the way up until now. But my question for you all is, what does a viable peace in Syria look like? What does it look like post-war?
Thank you very much.
One last comment? Yes.
Just a quick, I'm the diplomat in residence from the State Department this year. Really welcome this session, and the questions have been really tremendous. And like my colleague from India again, just as a personal question for you, for practitioners, and drawing upon Michael's question, for practitioners, what parameters do we use to encourage the Syrian opposition, which is still very fragmented, from coming to the table with the Assad regime, considering that the Assad regime, we believe, was culpable for using the ultimate weapon, for using chemical weapons against their own people? How can they possibly believe in a negotiation process with this government, and how can we facilitate that as practitioners? So I welcome your recommendations on that.
Excellent concluding questions about getting these, how do we get these peace talks to actually occur, and what is some visions of where it might actually come out that are both credible and maybe viable.
Shall I start?
Alex, absolutely.
Neither side is going to win. Both that's the bottom line. And if there is a victory, so-called, it will be in a completely ruined land. So they have to talk. And no matter what atrocities have been committed, they have to talk to each other. And there's been some that haven't been properly investigated and so on, but there's some pretty horrendous stories about the other side too. And so, for either side to say, we won't talk to the other because they're bad guys, no, it's not, it just doesn't wash. That's why you need to talk.
Any
So
ideas about how we incentivize that?
peace ought to be an incentive. But there will only be that possibility if you can, as it were, get the second ring, which is the regional players, the Iranians, the Qataris, the Saudis, and others, also as part of this, process. So it's a pretty difficult circle to square. And what would Iran, what would Syria look like? Well, that's really for the Syrians to negotiate. I very much doubt it would look like a straightforward majoritarian democracy. There has to be some very, very robust measures for the protection of minorities, and there are all sorts of formulae that can be worked out for those. The application of the territorial principle and majoritarian rule to that part of the Middle East has historically been fairly disastrous, and it would be compounding the disaster to have such a simplified resolution, so-called, in Syria. Last point, which is, I think, on the US national security interest. I'd like to see the US national security interest as being defined in part in that area by peace. Peace can be a form of security.
I'll just add something very briefly, which I think is an answer to both questions. And I don't have the full answer to what a viable peace in Syria would look like, of course, but it seems to me that in the medium to long term, Assad can't be part of it. And so I guess the trick is to somehow hold out the hope for the opposition that he'll be gone in due course, and hold out the hope in his mind that he'll somehow be gone gracefully. And, you know, I suppose this agreement buys time to try to get to the point where that sort of deal can be negotiated.
I don't know what peace is. Good idea to turn it off. I don't know what peace would look like, but I hope that the State Department is doing a good deal of planning with the experts, because you have to know a lot about the Alawites, the Sunnis, etc., to understand. And I think there's a lack of confidence in the United States because of what has happened in Iraq, and with good reason. I would like to disagree with you, Michael, is it?
That's correct.
Because I think we have spent 60 years trying to control weapons of mass destruction. I think if you look at the history of arms control treaties has been pretty consistent. Yes, there have been aberrations, and it's a bumpy road, as with 1988 in Iraq and Iran. But nevertheless, it has been a consistent effort, and I think there is an attempt to reach a norm, and I think it does make a huge difference. I don't think that what is going on now on chemical weapons really relates, which I think is the implication, to Israel and its red line. I wish that term had never existed. It's a really rotten term. I'd much rather talk in terms of legal and moral norms.
Well, I'll conclude by announcing my ignorance with respect to the two questions that were just asked. Number one, I don't have any idea how to incentivize the parties to press for peace. And second, with respect to the question of Israel and Iran, I do not understand why AIPAC threw itself into this fight on Capitol Hill. One of the reasons that it is the powerful and respected lobby that it is that it doesn't fight losing battles. This was a sure loser. This was going to lose in the House of Representatives. I don't understand why Israel sees Obama's failure to respect the red line that he drew with respect to Syria as having any implications at all for the promises that he seemingly has made Israel with respect to Iran. My impression is that the Israelis have been operating under the understanding that at some point, if the Iranians cross some line, the United States will join them in the strike against Iranian nuclear weapons facilities. I don't see why the Israelis would conclude that that is any less likely, although I gather that they are, and that they are reviewing their options, and that the whole region is less stable as a result of that.
I think we should conclude. This is clearly an ongoing conversation. Thank you all for staying and being part of it. We do have a plan to have another conversation here in a couple of weeks about the region, rather than just about Syria. As many people have said, this is not an isolated case. There are regional implications, and we might want to frame this as what happened to the Arab Spring. So I hope that you will join us for that as well. I want to thank the wonderful student organizations that organized this, and to be continued for sure. Thank you, and thank you to our panelists.